Aloha everyone, welcome to this lecture on Chapter 7C, the appendicular skeleton. So today we are going to finish up Chapter 7 on the skeleton by looking at the appendicular skeleton. And the appendicular skeleton is pretty much everything else that we didn't talk about with the axial skeleton in lectures 7A and 7B. Something that I heard that I kind of wanted to share with you, I thought it was a good analogy, is we should think of our skeleton as a puzzle, all right? So 206 different pieces to this puzzle. And the inside pieces of that puzzle are going to be what we already talked about. That's the axial skeleton, right? That central axis. Today, we're going to be talking about those edge pieces, right? And that's going to be our appendicular skeleton. So we're going to be focusing on the limbs here. We're going to be focusing on the pectoral girdle, the pelvic girdle, and then the lower limbs as well. And I also as I was kind of preparing this lecture, somebody was talking about how a lot of times we tend to think of the axial skeleton as being the most important, just because it has things like our brain and our spinal cord housed inside of it. But the reality is, think of what you wouldn't be able to do without your appendicular skeleton. You wouldn't have arms, right? So you couldn't bring food to your mouth. You couldn't write anything. You couldn't hold somebody's hand, give somebody a hug. You wouldn't be able to run or do any type of exercise movements, right, in terms of not having your legs. So I want you to realize that even though the axial skeleton is really important and we spent 2 lectures talking about it, the appendicular skeleton is really important as well. We need both of them together to make that whole puzzle, right, with all 206 bones in it. In terms of our learning outcomes for today, in this Chapter 7C appendicular skeleton lecture, first we're going to be distinguishing between the axial and the appendicular skeletons and list the major bones contained in each. Now obviously we've already listed the major bones in the axial skeleton. Today we'll be doing that in the appendicular skeleton, and you should be able to look back between all 3 lectures then and kind of do a comparison between the axial skeleton bones and the appendicular skeleton bones. Secondly is to identify the individual bones and their location within the body. So there are 126 different bones for the appendicular skeleton. Obviously, I'm not going to expect you to know all those, but I'm going to highlight certain ones and where they're at in the body, and those are the ones you'll need to know for the exam. Third, we're going to compare and contrast the male and female skeletons. We're particularly going to do this with regards to the pelvic girdle, because obviously that pelvic girdle is going to be a little different in a male versus a female, because a female is able to bear children. So these are our learning outcomes for today. Make sure you go back to this as you're starting to study for exam 2. You're probably not starting yet, but when you do start studying for exam 2, make sure you go back through these and know that you can answer them. You're probably thinking that I must really like this picture because it has been in each of the 3 lectures for Chapter 7, right? As a reminder, our skeleton is composed of bones, cartilages, joints, and ligaments. So it accounts for about 20% of our body mass, and there are 2 major divisions. The axial skeleton, which you see in this greenish gray color, right? That's going to be that central longitudinal axis. We covered that in lectures 7A and 7B. And then we have the appendicular skeleton, and that's essentially going to be everything that looks like a bone color or yellow in this image, right? So again, that's going to include our pectoral girdle, both of our arms, our pelvic girdle, and both of the legs. So a lot of times appendicular skeleton, people just think it's appendages. Well, it's the appendages, but it's also what attaches those appendages to the axial skeleton. So that's going to be your pectoral girdle and your pelvic girdle. So all of those together make up our appendicular skeleton, which is what we're going to cover today. So this is a little bit of a review of what I just said on the last slide, but this is what we're going to be talking about throughout today's lecture. We're going to focus on the pectoral girdle first. The main two bones we'll be talking about are the clavicle, or your collarbone, as well as the scapula, which many people think of as the shoulder blade region. This pectoral girdle is going to attach the upper limbs, so our arms, to the body trunk. In other words, it attaches our limbs to that axial skeleton. Our limbs or appendages, we have our arms, right? And the main bones that we'll be talking about in the arms are going to be the humerus, radius, and ulna. We're going to talk about our hands, the carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. Then we'll talk about our legs, big femur bone, right? And then your tibia and fibula, and then your foot, where you're going to have tarsals, metatarsals, and phalanges. And you'll see a lot of things similar in regards to the structure of the arm and the structure of the leg. Different bone names, but you'll see kind of a similar setup. You'll also see somewhat of a similar setup between the hand and the foot. Then we're also going to talk about the pelvic girdle. And this is going to be the coxal or your hip bones. And this is what's going to attach our lower limbs or our legs to our body or to that axial skeleton. So again, pectoral girdle, our limbs or appendages, and our pelvic girdle are what we're going to cover today. First thing that we're going to talk about is the pectoral girdle, which generally we think of our pectoral girdle as our shoulders, right? It is the point of attachment for our upper limbs or our arms, right? And it's going to consist of two major bones that we're going to talk about: the scapula, or your shoulder blades, and your clavicle. And your clavicle is that collarbone that you can probably feel if you try to feel it. So pectoral girdle is primarily used for mobility, right? So that axial part that we talked about in lecture 7B, that doesn't really move, right? What moves is that pectoral girdle. That's what allows our movement. The pectoral girdle is also going to support our upper limbs or our arms, and it's also going to serve as an attachment for muscles that are going to move our upper limbs. So it attaches that upper limb to the axial skeleton for the most efficient movement. And this is important because it offers a great deal of mobility. And the reason why it does this is because only the clavicle, or your collarbone, is going to actually attach to the axial skeleton. That's the only attachment point there. Everything else allows for movement because it isn't attached in that pectoral girdle. Also, the socket of our shoulder joint is very shallow and poorly reinforced, so it doesn't restrict a lot of movement. This is good in terms of flexibility, but bad because it's going to provide less stability. I'm sure you all know somebody who has had a shoulder injury before, right? That's because our shoulders allow for a lot of that flexibility, but they don't have a whole lot of stability. So you can see these bones here in this picture, and we're going to go more in depth looking at both the clavicle and the scapula in the following slides. But here you can see the scapula. It's kind of your shoulder blade, right? You can probably feel that on your posterior side as well. And then your clavicle, which is known as that collarbone, right? Runs across. That's going to be that point of attachment to your axial skeleton. Then you can see right here, chapter 8, we're going to talk a lot more about joints. But here is your acromioclavicular, sorry about that, joint right here. So that's going to be your shoulder joint, right? Where you have the joining of your humerus, which we're about to talk about, to this clavicle and your scapula right here. So this is showing you that right shoulder, the pectoral girdle, showing the relationship of the bones to the thorax over here, and then you can see part of that sternum right here as well. So when we look a little more at the clavicle, also known as our collarbone, it's kind of shaped like an S. So you can see that here, right? It has kind of a stretched out S shape. And that allows it to function like a crank when our arm is raised or lowered, right? We can usually feel that clavicle across our whole body. If you don't believe me, take a second. You can probably feel it, right? The clavicle works as kind of a strut, and that's what's meant over here. Anyone that's familiar with construction sites, or just maybe you're a big physics person and you love knowing the different operation of levers and different machines, your clavicle would be the strut right here. So it's kind of providing that support. The shoulder is going to hang from that, and it keeps that upper limb away from the torso. What that does is that's going to allow maximal free movement, because the clavicle is going to extend past the torso. So the clavicle is going to function in bracing, like say when you fall. Generally, it helps for protection, right? This ability to brace, though, leads to a lot of clavicle fractures. You've probably heard of somebody fracturing their collarbone before. And then the problem with that, when you fracture your clavicle, is that that shoulder is left without a connection to the rib cage. And it's usually going to fracture outwards. So on this clavicle, you can see there's different ends, right? You have this acromial end. This is a superior view. This is the inferior view. So on both of them, you can see this acromial end, or that lateral end. That's going to bind to the shoulder. It's more flattened. Then you have the sternal end, or this medial end, right here. That's your torso connection. And it comes more to a point, right? It looks more like a cone. So again, pointing out this top right figure. In this case, your clavicle would be the strut right here. The column is going to be your torso, and the load is going to be the shoulder. It kind of makes sense if you think about it, right? That collarbone is keeping your shoulder, this upper limb, away from your torso, allowing that maximal free movement, right? And then this column right here is your torso. So if that helps you to kind of remember, think of the clavicle as being a strut. The other major bone that is part of the pectoral girdle is our scapula. And again, oftentimes we call the scapula the shoulder blade. It is very thin, triangular, and the type of bone it is in terms of shape is a flat bone, right? And it's going to be on the dorsal surface of the rib cage. So in other words, it's on your back, right? And it's located between ribs 2 and 7. So you can see here the flat shape of it, kind of triangular in shape. Does anyone know how it got its name? Why we call it the scapula? So the reason why we call it the scapula is that people used to actually use animal scapula or animal shoulder blades as a spade or a shovel to dig. So that's how it got its name as being the scapula. One thing that I'd like to point out here, you can see this dark bolded area. Anytime you see these bolded rectangles on these diagrams, those are the things I really want you to key in on. There's a lot of things in these diagrams. It gets super overwhelming quickly, as you saw in lecture 7A with the skull, but pay attention to those that are actually have this little square around them. That means you need to know them. So this glenoid cavity, this is showing you from the anterior aspect what that looks like. What the glenoid cavity is it's going to articulate or join with the humerus of the arm. So the head of the humerus is going to attach to the scapula right here at the glenoid fossa. So that's that important articulation there. Then if you flip the scapula over, the spine portion of the scapula on the posterior end can easily be felt through the skin. So this is that posterior view, this is that spine. So if you take your hand back and try to feel your shoulder blade, that part that really sticks out and is easily felt through your skin, that's known as the spine of your scapula. So on the one end, we have this spine region, right? And the other end is going to be this acromion. That's going to be the end point of that shoulder blade. We also have the coracoid process right here. Again, you can see that I bolded that for you to let you know that you need to know it. It almost looks like beak-like. And in a way, like, I don't know, maybe this will help you remember it. To me, it looks like a bent finger. Like if I had longer fingers, it would look like a bent finger to me. And it helps to anchor your bicep muscle in your arm. So another important thing there with the coracoid process. There are also a lot of different borders on the scapula. And those borders kind of form like a triangle. So there are 3 different angles or 3 different points. So you have your superior border right here on top. Right? You have your inferior on the bottom. Here's that inferior angle. And then you have your lateral borders on the sides. So you can see that both in the anterior as well as the posterior view, right? You have your superior border, your inferior border. It says angle here, but that's a border. And then your lateral border on the side. Here's your lateral border, inferior, and that superior up there on the top in this posterior view. So those are the important things that I want to point out here in terms of the scapula. So here is kind of another look at the individual bones of the pectoral or that shoulder girdle. So anytime you hear the word process, I want you to think of something that's protruding out. Anytime you hear the word fossa, think cavity. So you should be able to feel this acromion at the tip of the shoulder, right? And you should be able to feel the coracoid process coming forward a bit medial to that. What this structure does is that it actually allows you to hold up the upper part of your pectoral area, but it also extends down, as you can see a little bit here, to provide support below. So this is kind of just showing you this in a view like this. To me, it kind of looks like a goal post, only instead of that being in the middle, it's off to the side. But again, that acromion right here, your coracoid process, this glenoid cavity that we talked about before, remember that's where that humerus is going to come in and articulate with that. So again, the pectoral girdle is important to help to anchor our upper limbs to that axial skeleton. And it's your clavicle or your collarbone that does actually anchor, and then your shoulder blade is going to provide a lot of support there for your limbs as well. So hopefully you've learned a little bit more about the pectoral girdle now. Next, we're going to move on and look at our upper limb extremity. So in other words, we're going to be looking at our arm, the parts of our arm, right? So we talked about the clavicle right here. We talked about the scapula right here. Now we're going to move into looking at the upper limb, which is 30 bones total. So the arm, this big bone right here, you have your humerus. The forearm is going to consist of 2 bones, your ulna and your radius. Then you have your wrist, which is going to have 8 carpal bones. Then you have your hand, which is 5 metacarpal bones, and 14 phalanges in your fingers. And again, you're going to double those numbers, right? Because generally we have 2 arms. In terms of joints, you don't need to pay particular attention to this in this lecture because chapter 8, we're going to cover all about the joints. But I already mentioned your shoulder up here. That's your glenohumeral. And hopefully you can break that word down and figure out why we call it the glenohumeral, right? Because remember, it's that glenoid cavity where that humerus is going to articulate with. That's why we call it the glenohumeral. We also have our elbow joint right here. We have our wrist joint right here. We have our metacarpopharyngeal joint, and then the inner pharyngeal joint that allows you to bend tips of your fingers. So those are the different joints that you see. Again, we'll talk more about those in chapter 8. So as we move forward here, we're going to be covering the upper limb. A little bit later, we're going to cover the lower limb, and hopefully you can see some of the similarities there, as well as a few of the differences too. So first, we are going to be looking at the humerus. And here you can see this humerus bone. As a reminder, the humerus is what actually articulates with the shoulder, that pectoral girdle that we just finished talking about. The humerus is the only bone in our upper arm. So this is our upper arm, right? From top of the elbow to the shoulder joint here, the only bone there is your humerus. It is the largest and longest bone of our upper limb. It articulates superiorly with the glenoid cavity of the scapula, which I already mentioned when we looked at the scapula, right? And it's going to articulate inferiorly with the radius and ulna. So down here is where it's going to articulate with the two bones of the forearm, known as the radius and ulna. It has this hemisphere-like head region up here, and that allows it to move freely on one side. And then there's different tubercles. You can see here the greater tubercle, lesser tubercle. Those tubercles are going to be attachments for the rotator cuff muscles. And as you know, I know a lot of people that have had rotator cuff surgery, right? Again, remember that we talked about how that shoulder has a lot of flexibility but not a lot of stability. So if you do something wrong, it's pretty easy to mess up those muscles there, including your rotator cuff muscles. We also have this inner tubercle sulcus right here. That's going to be a groove that actually guides the tendons of your bicep right here to attach to the glenoid cavity. Then if you move down this, you see what's known as the surgical neck region. So right here is your surgical neck. And that surgical neck is actually pretty fragile, and it's a most likely area of fracture. So if you fracture your humerus bone, the most likely area that happens is right in this region, right below that head of the humerus. The midway part of the humerus bone is going to be what's known as this deltoid tuberosity. And this is a roughened attachment for, you probably guessed it, your deltoid muscles. We also have an important groove that you can see over here in the posterior view, right here. This is known as your radial groove, and it's where your radial nerve is going to go. And you can only see it here in the posterior view. You do not see it in the anterior view. Then on the distal end of the humerus are going to be a lot of different condyles, and you can see some of those here. The trochlea, so right here you see the trochlea, right? To me that kind of looks like a sideways hourglass. And then you have the capitulum, which is right here, and that capitulum is kind of a ball-like structure. So these are going to be the attachment sites for the radius and the ulna respectively. The medial epicondyle, which you see right here in both the anterior view as well as the posterior view, this is going to be where the muscles actually start to attach. Then you have the ulnar nerve that's going to run behind this medial epicondyle. And has anyone ever heard of, oh, you hit your funny bone? Well, that's what you're feeling, is when you hit that portion of your arm. What you're doing is you're hitting that ulnar nerve, and it's running behind that medial epicondyle, and that causes that stinging, tingling feeling of hitting your funny bone. Above this are going to be all these supracondyle ridges, and these are going to be kind of the last part of the bone that provides structure for all the different epicondyles and fossas to exist. So just as kind of a reminder, I know we kind of covered this a little bit in chapter 6, as well as talked a little bit about it in lab if you're in lab, but condyles, what I mean by that, they're just going to be rounded articular surfaces. And then an epicondyle is just a proximal feature to a condyle. So you can see here, trying to find a good example. There's a couple different epicondyles here. This lateral epicondyle, you have this media epicondyle. So again, anytime you hear the word epicondyle, that's just a proximal feature to a condyle. So a lot of different processes here on the humerus. So in terms of the bones of your upper arm, there's only one, right? Or of your arm, there's only one, but there's a lot of different processes associated with that humerus. This right here shows you a much more zoomed in view. So this is the humerus of our right arm and detailed views of the articulation at our elbow region, right in here. So the different fossa here, so you can see a lot of these different fossa. There's a coronoid fossa, there is an olecranon fossa. Those fossa are going to be depressions, right? And that's going to allow the ulna to move freely when the elbow is flexed and extended. The radial fossa, which I highlighted for you here, those are going to be the smallest, so right in here, and that's going to receive the head of the ulna. The capitulum right here is what's actually going to bind to the radius. The trochlea is the part that does the actual binding to the ulna. So you have your radius coming and attaching right here at the capitulum, and you have your ulna coming right here and attaching to the trochlea. And if it helps you to kind of remember it, to me, I use trochlea starts with a T, ulna starts with a U. They're very close together. So the ulna is going to go right here at the trochlea, whereas that capitulum is where the radius goes. So if that helps you, definitely use it. But this just shows you kind of a more zoomed in view here of that elbow joint, where you're going from our humerus up here to our radius and our ulna. Okay, now we're moving down to our forearm, which is going to be this region right here. So there are two parallel bones that form our forearm skeleton. I've already talked a little bit about them. We have our ulna and our radius. So the proximal ends of these are going to articulate with our humerus right in here, right? And they're also going to articulate with each other. Distally, they're going to articulate down here at our radial ulnar joint. Something else that we have, and you'll see it in the next image, is what's known as the interosseous membrane. And what that interosseous membrane is going to do is it connects the radius and ulna along their entire length. And like I said, you'll see that in the picture coming up. So again, we have those two parallel bones that are going to form our forearm skeleton, forearm right here. It's going to be our radius and our ulna. So this is showing you the radius and ulna of the right forearm. Again, those proximal ends, this will be up here, right? The proximal ends are going to articulate with the humerus. And as you can see, they also articulate with each other, right? Then the distal ends down here are going to articulate with what's known as the radial ulnar joint. I mentioned in the previous slide this thing called the interosseous membrane, and you can see that here in white. So this is in that anterior view, over here is in the posterior view. And that interosseous membrane is going to connect the radius and ulna along their entire length. So what this interosseous membrane is it's kind of this flat, flexible ligament. And interosseous, if you break that word down, it literally means between the bones, right? So this is between that radius and ulna bone. When we are in anatomical position, that radius is going to lie laterally on our thumb side, right? And the ulna is going to be more medial or next to our body. But if we go and pronate, which means to move our palms back, then we see that the distal end of that radius is going to cross over the ulna and it creates an X. So something to note is that your ulna actually doesn't move, but the radius does. So if the radius moves, our hand is going to move. So you can see right here this image of the person in anatomical position. And again, you're going to have your radius right here, ulna right here. And again, as a reminder, that ulna doesn't move. The radius is going to move as we move our hand. You'll notice if you look here that your ulna is slightly longer, right? It's a little bit longer than the radius is. And the ulna has this little hook type shape right here at that top. And this is at what's known as the olecranon right here. And that's because it's going to form the elbow joint of the humerus. There are also going to be several different notches, and those notches are, for example, your radial notch. That's what's actually going to articulate with the radius. So I think you can see, yeah, this radial notch, I highlighted it right here. That's where you're going to see this articulation between the radius and the ulna. The radius, on the other hand, is going to have this nail-shaped head, right? It kind of looks like a nail. If you were to pound on top of a nail with a hammer, this kind of looks like the top of that nail. And at the radial tuberosity, which I highlighted for you right here, is where that biceps muscle is going to attach. So it attaches right down there. The ulnar notch is going to bind to the radius, but it also binds to the styloid process of the wrist. So if you look down here, you can see that ulnar notch right here in the posterior view, right here in that anterior view. And again, at that ulnar notch is going to bind, you can see it binding to the radius, right? But it also binds to this styloid process of the wrist. So at the bottom of the radius, really, right here, this radial styloid process, this is where we see that our wrist starts to form. So something that's actually pretty common is to fracture part of your forearm. And this is known as a Colles fracture. It's a break in the distal end of your radius. And the deformity that's caused kind of looks like a fork. So it's a very common fracture if you think about it, because if you're about to fall, what's the first thing that you do? It's not you put your knees down, it's not, oh, I better put my head down, right? The first thing you do is you're gonna brace yourself like this, right? So you're gonna brace, like you can see here, and that causes this fracturing at the distal end of your radius. So you can see that motion here. It's exactly what we do when we fall, right? It's just instinctual. So this is very common because, again, a person that's falling is trying to break their fall with outstretched hands. And that's going to cause a fracture in the distal end of your radius. So if you do go into a clinical setting, this might be something that you see a lot in the ER from people that are trying to brace their falls. Next, we're going to move from our forearm right here into our hand region, right? So the bones of our hand, or using the correct terminology, our manus, is going to include our carpals, our metacarpals, and our phalanges. So the carpus or wrist is going to have 8 bones in 2 rows. The proximal row, if we move going from lateral to media, so the outside to the middle, It's going to be our scaphoid, lunate, trabeculum, and pisiform. The distal row, going again lateral to medial, is going to be trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, and hamate. And then only the scaphoid, lunate, and triquetrum are going to form that actual wrist joint. Then we have our metacarpus. In other words, that's going to be our palm region. So we have 5 metacarpal bones, and they are numbered in Roman numerals 1 to 5, starting at the thumb to your little finger, and that forms the palm. The bases are going to articulate with the carpals, and the heads are going to articulate with the proximal phalanges. So your phalanges are going to be our fingers, right? Our fingers are our digits. They're numbered again 1 to 5, starting at the thumb or that pollex. Digit 1, the pollex, has 2 bones because we don't have a middle bone there. We only have 2 in our thumb. Whereas the rest of our digits, we actually have 3 bones. So we have distal, middle, and proximal bones in those. And I know this is a lot on this slide. What I'm actually going to do is pretty much repeat this same slide on the next slide where we have an image and walk you through it where all the different bones are found. So here you can see the bones of the right hand. So again, your carpus is going to be your wrist region, and there are 8 bones in 2 rows. So in your proximal row, this row that's going to be right next to your radius and ulna, if you move from the lateral to media area, you have your scaphoid right here, your lunate right here, your triquetrum right here, and then right next to that you have your pisiform. Then if you go to the distal row, you're going to start right here with your trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, sorry about that, and your hamate. So those are going to be the 8 different bones that are in our wrist or our carpus. And again, only your scaphoid right here, your lunate, which is right next to it, and your triquetrum, which is right here. I always stumble on that word for some reason, but those 3 bones are the only ones that actually form that wrist joint. Then we have our metacarpus, or our palm. So for this, we have 5 metacarpal bones. Again, they're going to be numbered using Roman numerals, so 1 to 5. And you're going to start at the thumb. So this is number 1 right here, number 2, number 3, number 4, and number 5. The base is going to articulate with these carpals, right? And then the heads are going to articulate up here with your proximal phalanges. Speaking of those phalanges, these are phalanges up here, right? Or in other words, our fingers. So the fingers are digits. They're numbered again from 1 to 5. And we start at the thumb or the pollex. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And your pollex is only going to have 2 bones. You can see that here, right? 1, 2 bones. In terms of the rest of our phalanges, they're going to have 3 bones. And it shows you that here. This is that distal bone, middle, and proximal. Distal, middle, proximal, distal, middle, proximal, distal, middle, proximal. So that's going to be our hand or our manus, the different portions of that with our carpals, our metacarpus or that palm region, as well as the phalanges. So far we've talked about that pectoral girdle, right? We've talked about our upper extremities. Now we're going to move on down to the lower part of our body, and we're going to begin talking about the pelvic girdle. The pelvic girdle is sometimes also called the hip girdle. It's going to be formed by 2 hip bones, also known as our coxal bones or coxae, and also the sacrum. What our pelvic girdle does is it's going to attach the lower limbs to the axial skeleton with really strong ligaments. So in a way, it functions like our pectoral girdle did, in some regards, right? Because that pectoral girdle is actually what attaches to the axial skeleton. Same thing here, the pelvic girdle is what attaches to the axial skeleton. The pelvic girdle is going to transmit weight of the upper body to these lower limbs, and it helps to support our pelvic organs. There are 3 fused bones that actually form the coxal bone: the ilium, ischium, and the pubis. And there is a deep socket acetabulum that's formed at the point of fusion that's going to receive the head of this big femur bone. So again, coxal is your hip bones, and when we were younger, these bones here that are now fused, the ilium, ischium, and pubis, these were not fused when we were younger. But as we grow, become adults, they become fused bones that form that coxal bone. So you can see on this slide, we're talking about kind of comparing and contrasting the pelvic girdle, which we're just starting to talk about, with the pectoral girdle that we talked about earlier. So down here is that pectoral girdle that we've already talked about with that clavicle and your scapula, right? Up here is the pelvic girdle. And the primary function of our pelvic girdle is stability. Whereas if you remember, the primary function of our pectoral girdle was for mobility, right? Having that flexibility without a lot of stability. So pelvic girdle, we're all about that stability. The primary functions, again, are to bear the weight of the upper body, whether we're standing or sitting, to transfer that upper weight to our lower appendicular skeleton, and to provide attachment for very powerful muscles of locomotion and posture, as well as our abdominal muscles too. Some of the secondary functions of the pelvic girdle are to contain and protect the pelvic viscera, or in other words, those organs, to provide support for the abdominal pelvic viscera and the fetus. And we're talking about those that are able to bear children. Provide attachment for erectile bodies of external genitalia, and to provide attachment for muscles and membrane that are going to make up our pelvic floor. So as a reminder, again, pelvic girdle, we're all about stability here. In terms of the pectoral girdle, it was all about mobility, supporting the upper limbs, being an attachment for muscles, attaching that upper limb, your that clavicle is that actual attachment point to the axial skeleton to allow for the most efficient movement. So what I want to point out here is that both of these, our pelvic girdle and our pectoral girdle, are very important. They're both girdles, but they have different functions. Pelvic girdle is for stability, pectoral girdle is for mobility. So now I want to point out some of those different portions of the pelvic girdle that we talked about a couple slides ago. So remember, I told you that we have 3 bones that fuse to form that coxal bone, right? So we have our ilium, our ischium, and our pubis. So again, these are going to fuse, this ilium region here, the pubis, the ischium, they're fused to make up that coxal bone. So this over here is in the lateral view. You can also still see those 3 bones, your ilium, I highlighted them for you here, your ilium, your pubis here in red, and this ischium here in purple. And really, your book did a good job of color coding it for you, right? So the ilium is in this bone color, pubis is in red, ischium is in purple. Again, these are not fused when we're children, they're fused as adults. You can also see the sacrum. I highlighted that again for you right here. So your sacrum region, it is part of the axial skeleton, so it's not part of the appendicular skeleton. We already talked about it. But what it does is it's attached to the ilium, and it holds everything together. The ilium, as you can obviously see from these images, is going to be the largest part of our hip bone. Then the pubis is going to be below that, and the posterior end is going to be the ischium. So again, those 3 bones are fused together to form our hip bone or that coxal bone. So here you can see, looking at the difference between the female true and false pelvises. So the pelvis, again, is going to be formed by the hip bones, the sacrum, and the coccyx. And the female pelvis, as we'll see in the next slide as well, tends to be wider, shallower, lighter, and rounder than a male's. And the reason for that is it's adapted for childbearing. So here you're seeing the difference between what we term a false pelvis and a true pelvis. So the false pelvis that you're seeing right here, it's going to be this red portion. The false pelvis is actually part of our abdomen, and it supports a lot of the abdominal viscera or abdominal organs. Whereas the true pelvis, which is in this dotted line region in blue, that's going to be the actual pelvis, and it contains all of the pelvis viscera or pelvic organs. And the pelvic brim, which is actually this dotted line, that's your pelvic brim, that's going to be the widest portion of your true pelvis. So a lot of people consider this to be your pelvis, this whole wide region right here. That's the false pelvis. Right in here is that true pelvis. That pelvic brim is that widest portion. One of the first slides, we talked about our learning outcomes for this lecture, right? And I talked about comparing male versus female appendicular skeletons. I told you this would be particularly in regards to that pelvic girdle. And the reason for this is that there are differences between the male and female pelvis. The false pelvis, if we're looking at that area that's really also containing the abdominal viscera, there's not as big of a difference in that false pelvis between males and females. But the true pelvis is going to be much larger, and the pubic arches are much wider in females. So you can kind of see that in this image. This goes through a comparison of the male and female pelvises. The female, you can see right here, notice much wider, obviously, right? The pubic arches are wider. These are your pubic arches right here. Look at that major difference in the width here versus here. So definitely much wider pubic arches in females. This is why people generally say that females are going to have bigger hip regions. And again, this is not by accident. This is an adaptation to be able to be used in childbearing, right? Because if you think of we talked before about how the head of an infant has those fontanelles that become kind of cone-shaped as it goes through that birth canal, because the head is so much larger than the birth canal. So we need this pelvis to be wider. We need these pubic arches to be wider in order to allow for that childbearing. So when we look at the pelvic girdle and the hip joint terminology, because obviously that's where we're going to see that articulation of our hip, right? So the pelvic girdle, there are two hip bones that are going to be united at the pubic symphysis. And they're going to articulate posteriorly with the sacrum. So you see the sacrum right here, your pubic symphysis is right down here. So they're going to articulate posteriorly with the sacrum at the sacroiliac joints. The bony pelvis is going to be two hip bones, your sacrum and your coccyx. So you can see your sacrum right here, your coccyx right here. And that actual hip joint is going to be the articulation of the acetabulum with the head of the femur. So you can see that here, this hip joint. You see the head of the femur right here, and that's going to be that acetabulum region right here in blue. That's actually where that femur is going to come in there and form that hip joint. And again, we're going to talk a little more about this hip joint when we cover joints in Chapter 8. Okay, so moving on to actually the last kind of region of the appendicular skeleton, and that's going to be our lower limb, or in other words, our legs. This is going to carry the weight of our erect body, and it is subjected to exceptional forces whenever we are jumping, running, any type of motion. All that weight is going to be put on our lower limbs. There are 3 different segments of the lower limb that we're going to cover. We're going to look at the thigh, which is our big femur bone, our leg, which is going to be our tibia and our fibula, and then our foot. And if you notice, this is kind of similar to our arm structure, right? For our arms, for the arm portion, instead of the femur bone, right, we had that humerus. For the forearm, we had 2 bones there as well, right, radius and ulna, whereas for the leg portion, we have tibia and fibula. And then foot and hand, we're going to see some similarities there as well. So make sure as we kind of go through this lower limb, you're making those connections and seeing how it's similar as well as different to our upper limb that we already covered. We're going to begin with our thigh region right here. Our femur is going to be our largest and strongest bone in the body. It makes up about 1/4 of a person's height. It's going to articulate proximally with the acetabulum of the hip, which we just covered a couple of slides ago, right? And then it articulates distally with our tibia and our patella. And that patella is going to be a sesamoid bone. We talked about that a little bit back in chapter 6. In that quadriceps region, it's a sesamoid bone in that quadriceps tendon that's going to protect our knee joint, right? So that's going to be our thigh. We'll look at this actual images on the next slide. So again, as a reminder, the femur is the largest and strongest bone in our body. Again, it makes up about 1/4 of a person's height. And it's very similar to that humerus that we talked about in our arm. There are a lot of our very bulky muscles in the femur region. The femur is going to articulate proximally. So up here, it's going to articulate with the acetabulum of the hip. And it's going to articulate distally down here with the tibia and the patella. And again, as a reminder, that patella is that kneecap region. It's that sesamoid bone in the quadricep tendon that protects the knee joint. So that it's kind of your kneecap. The neck of your femur is going to have a bulbous head. So you can see this bulbous head here in the anterior view as well as that posterior view. And that's what connects to the hip. That's what articulates with that acetabulum. Then when we go down it, the shaft region, it's not called the shaft of the femur, it's called the linea aspera. And then we have the condyles down here. You see a lot of different condyles as well as some epicondyles. So those are going to bind to the patella, the fibula, and the tibia. Again, very big, strong bone here, taking on a lot of the pressure that we're transmitting every time we do different types of movement. Next, we have our lower leg. This is going to be made up of 2 parallel bones, our tibia, which is going to be in front, and then our fibula, which is in the back. They are connected by an interosseous membrane, very similar to, remember when we talked about our forearm region right here? We had our radius and our ulna, and those were connected by an interosseous membrane. Our tibia is going to be the medial leg bone, and it's going to receive the weight of the body from the femur. That's going to transmit it to the foot. So we're putting a lot of strain, pressure, weight on our femur as well as our tibias. Your fibula, on the other hand, is not weight-bearing. There is no articulation with the femur. There are several muscles that are going to originate from the fibula, and it articulates proximally as well as distally with the tibia. So kind of a story just to, I don't know if this will help you remember what's weight-bearing, what isn't, and the different bones. But I was actually a collegiate cross-country and track runner. I unfortunately was not a very good one though in college because we were running close to 100 miles a week, lots of mileage, and I ended up with 7 stress fractures. just in the first 3 years of college. The majority of those were in my tibia region. In fact, anytime the weather changes, I can still feel all of those. I can see bruises still where each one of those stress fractures was. They never healed that well because obviously it was, 6 weeks in the boot and get back out there and keep running, make sure that I keep my scholarship. And it got so bad that I actually collapsed on the track during a 1,500 meter race. And the reason why I collapsed, they thought it was a strained quad muscle, but I literally could not move. I could not walk. I could not get up the stairs. And it turns out that my tibia had become so weakened by all those stress fractures. Remember, your tibia is taking on a lot of that weight from your femur, right? So the tibia was so weak that my femur actually fractured. That's why I could not walk. So the amount of pain from that fracture in my femur is probably the reason why I will never forget what bones in our leg are weight bearing, right? That femur is taking on a lot of that weight, and it's going to lead to or articulate, as you can see here, it's going to receive that weight of the body from the femur. So tibia, femur are going to be what's weight bearing in our leg, right? Whereas that fibula is not going to be weight bearing. So I don't know if that little story helps you to kind of remember what's weight bearing and what isn't, but I can promise you that I will never forget what is weight bearing and what isn't. And again, just a reminder, your lower leg is very similar to the forearm structure, right? Different names of the bones. In our forearm, it was the radius and the ulna. Lower leg, it's our tibia and fibula, but very similar structure. Again, they're going to be connected by that interosseous membrane, just like the radius and ulna were. So again, that lower leg is going to be made up of 2 parallel bones, the tibia and the fibula. So they're going to be connected, as you can see, by this white material here. That's that interosseous membrane. And again, the bigger bone here that's actually weight-bearing is your tibia. This is in the posterior view. This is in that anterior view. That's your tibia. The smaller bone that is not weight-bearing is going to be your fibula. Again, connected by that interosseous membrane. And the tibia is that medial leg bone. You can see it's right here. It's going to be larger. It's going to receive that weight from the femur, transmits it to the foot region right down here where it's going to articulate. I'm not going to point out, there are so many different processes here that I could point out to you, but I feel like you've probably already had enough of those in terms of chapter 7. So I'm not going to go through all of these different condyles here. Just remember, right up here is where that femur is going to articulate. It's going to articulate and put that weight directly onto your tibia. Your fibula is back here. It does not directly receive any of that weight because that fibula is non-weight bearing. So next we have our foot. So connected to that distal region of the tibia or the fibula is going to be your foot. And the skeleton of the foot has bones of the tarsus, metatarsus, and phalanges. So your tarsus is 7 tarsal bones that form the posterior half. The body weight is going to be carried primarily by just 2 of those. It's going to be carried by the talus and the calcaneus. The calcaneal tuberosity is the part that's actually going to touch the ground each time that you take a step or when you're standing up. And your sustacular tali, or that tali shelf, is going to be what supports your talus. The other tarsal bones, so the other 5, are going to be the cuboid, the navicular, the medial, intermediate, and lateral cuneiform. So medial cuneiform, intermediate cuneiform, and the lateral cuneiform. Then we have our metatarsals. So very similar to what we saw with our tarsals. Metatarsals, there are 1 to 5, going from the hallux, which is your big toe, to your little toe. The enlarged head of metatarsal 1, or that hallux, is going to form the ball region of your foot. Then you have your phalanges. So 14 bones of your toes. Digit 1, again, is the hallux. It's your great toe or your big toe. It has 2 bones, no middle phalanx. Just like our thumb or our pollex, right? It only had 2 bones. Digits 2 to 5 are all going to have 3 bones. Again, just like with our fingers, it's going to be distal, middle, and proximal. And I know this is a lot to put on one side. We're going to actually kind of repeat this exact same slide, only do that using a picture on the next slide to hopefully make it make more sense. So here are those bones. This is showing you the right foot. And again, the skeleton of the foot is going to include bones of the tarsus. These are your tarsals. It's going to also include bones of the metatarsals right here, and then your phalanges right here. So let's start with the tarsus. These are your tarsals in this region, right? If you remember, there are a lot of bones of the tarsals, and the trochlea, right here you see the trochlea of the talus. This is what is actually going to bind to our lower leg region. So it's going to bind to that tibia. So again, the tarsus, there are 7 different tarsal bones that form this posterior half here. The body weight is going to be carried primarily, again, by your talus, which is right here, as well as your calcaneus, right here. So those 2 bones are going to take most of that body weight that's transmitted through your tibia. The other tarsal bones are going to be the cuboid, right here, navicular. You also have your medial cuneiform, your intermediate cuneiform, and your lateral cuneiform. So those are going to be your tarsal bones. Then you have your metatarsals. There are going to be 5 metatarsal bones going from 1 to 5 in Roman numerals. You're going to start at your big toe, your hallux, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And again, the enlarged head of metatarsal 1, so right here, you can see it's larger than these other 4. That is going to form what we call the ball of our foot. Then we have our phalanges right up here. So there are 14 bones of the toes. Digit 1, your hallux, notice how there's only 2. Whereas these other 4, there are going to be 3 bones, right? The distal medial proximal, distal medial proximal, distal medial proximal, distal medial proximal. So these have 3, so that's 12 bones total, 13, 14. So 14 bones of our toes. So if you're an athlete at all, especially if you're a runner, you've probably heard about arches of the foot, right? And this figure is just kind of showing you the lateral aspect of the right foot. It's showing you this lateral longitudinal arch in green, this transverse arch in red right here, as well as this medial longitudinal arch, because we're not meant to be flat-footed, right? And what maintains this arch of our foot is the interlocking foot bones, ligaments, and tendons. And this allows our foot to actually bear our weight because of the flexibility of that arch. So take your foot, kind of feel that. Hopefully you have an arch there. We're going to look on the next slide what happens if you don't. So you've noticed generally we have in these lectures these little slides that talk about homeostatic imbalance, right? Because I told you how important homeostasis was for this class. And this is kind of a clinical implication as well. So a homeostatic imbalance can occur if we don't have that arch on our foot. So flat foot, also known as pes planus, sometimes called fallen arches, can be a congenital condition or it can be acquired later in life. You could have great arches when you're younger and then later in life, for some reason, that arch goes away. It can also be caused by, like I said, increasing age, be caused by obesity or just a lot of really high impact activities. Something that can really help with this is wearing proper footwear with good arch support. It can help to prevent the problem. One Orthotic shoe inserts can also help to manage the symptoms, so they can kind of put an arch in that orthotic, and as long as you wear those, it can kind of help your foot it forms that arch when you're wearing that shoe at least, so it can help with some of those problems. So you can see here's a flat foot, doesn't have any of those arches that we saw in the last slide, whereas a normal foot, you see that arch shape to it, right? And that causes your side of your foot, notice how it's straight like that instead of having that curve to your foot like you should. Something you've probably heard before is military generally doesn't like flat-footed people because it can lead to problems in terms of your bones, other things, because remember, we're transmitting that weight to our feet, right? So if our feet we don't have that arch support, it can lead to a lot of orthotic problems. Okay, so that is the end of our appendicular skeleton and the end of chapter 7. I know there was a lot in this chapter. So something I would like you to do, hopefully long before the night before exam 2, is to go through these slides in chapter 7 and either make a list of the different bones and processes that I highlighted and talked about, or you can make note cards of them. In the past, I've had students that would redraw the diagram, or they would just print off the diagram if you have access to a printer, and they'd white out all the different things, and then they put numbers for the different ones that they were supposed to know. And by supposed to know, that means I talked about it in lecture, or they have that little box around them. That means you should know them. We may cover more. We're going to cover more of them in lab, but the main ones are what I've covered in these lectures. Again, keep in mind 206 bones in our skeleton. So if I went through every one of those bones, it would take a lot longer than these 3 lectures did. So you're not required to know all 206 of those. You're not required to know every single process of the bones. But just the ones that I covered in the lectures. Try not to get overwhelmed. One way to not get overwhelmed is to maybe actually give yourself a list of those so that you know what you're actually required to know. That might help you a little bit. Again, those note cards. There are plenty of study tools to help you as well. There are a lot of good videos online. You'll notice in the supplemental material for chapter 6, there was a good video there that talked about bones. Unfortunately, that particular author of videos doesn't have one for the appendicular and axial skeleton, but there are other videos out there as well too. If you have questions, let me know. I'm always responsive to emails. We can also schedule office hours. But most of all, make sure you're following along in your e-text using those Pearson resources. I mentioned this before exam 1, but literally there is a study area on Pearson, and it will give you quizzes and practice tests for each chapter in your textbook. So you're paying for this resource. Use it. Use those practice quizzes and tests. Again, there's going to be some things in the e-text that I don't necessarily cover in lecture, and you're not responsible for that. And so you might see a few questions on there that you're like, wait, we didn't talk about this. Why am I supposed to know this? And you're not. If I didn't cover it in lecture, you're not responsible for it. But it's always better to know more rather than to know less, right? So again, use those resources and let me know if you have questions. Mahalo for hanging in there, and I will see you for our Chapter 8 lecture on joints.